romanticization, appropriation, commodification, cultural erasure. Can these desires, despite their danger, be harnessed, converted, channeled to promote Indigenous futures? You can have a place. Never settle.
Satire and irony and parody, I feel like they get a bad name these days because of this kind of like maybe Gen X hangover around certain ideas of like a lack of engagement or nihilism even. But I think at its core, irony has a really radical potential, because when does irony like stop becoming real or start becoming real? Or that kind of like willful manifestation of an alternative reality is something we're really interested in pursuing and developing. Like if you say something is real enough times, maybe it is. And that's part of the approach in terms of like how we're reaching out to folks. Ani Bojo, Shingwak Indishnakas, Bawating and Donjaba. My name's Adam Khalil. I'm a filmmaker and artist, originally from northern Michigan, with my tribe's reservation, the Sault Ste. Tribe of Chippewa Indians. It's funny to talk about my practice because it is collaborative, but I guess I could kind of put it into different containers in terms of that there's kind of like 3 core collaborative constellations. There's one with my brother, Zach Khalil. I've known him for a really long time. We have similar life experiences, a shared set of references. And me and my brother's work has been really focused back in our community in northern Michigan, and thinking through ways to kind of create an inherently Ojibway form of cinema. Ojibway is the tribe I'm from. Like where my tribe is headquartered in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, has been under the process of colonization since 1650, which is different than a lot of other tribes in the States, which had contact later, like in the 1850s. And that also means that there's a lot of intermixing, racially, but also culturally in the area that I'm from. Practically speaking, it was illegal to practice indigenous spiritual practices until 1973. So a lot of things have been repressed or forcibly forgotten. There's a long history of residential schools where people were forcibly removed from their families to become white. And I think a lot of our work is taking an approach of a serious joke in terms of that history is so traumatic to unpack and still lingers on to this day in many different ways, that to push back against that with rage and humor is the kind of tone that makes sense to us. It's also like understanding how absurd the situation is and kind of embracing that absurdity and trying to represent that back in a very flat way. I feel like something I was taught for a while is never to think about the audience, to just express yourself and put those things out there. And that always felt really wrong to me because the thing doesn't exist until the audience consumes it. And being really honest with myself and others about that apparatus in terms of production and consumption. So I think like across all of the practices, we're constantly thinking of the audience and trying to create situations where the audience feels unsettled because the content is very serious, but there's a tone that's humorous. And I think that goes back to where me and my brother grew up. There's this role of the trickster that's really important to kind of like Anishinaabe or Ojibwe cosmology and identities. That, you know, to see the world upside down, it might actually make more sense or something. Or this kind of sacred clown affect that I think we're really invested in because it gives an ability to talk about things that are really difficult, but that maybe people can hear them. I think one of the reasons we drifted away from traditional documentary is that the audience can leave with a feeling of having done something when really all they've done is consume something, especially when it comes to like social issue documentary. me and my brother, and actually all of our collaborators, have a kind of healthy distrust of documentary film, especially as Indigenous artists, knowing the history of documentary and this kind of proximity documentary has to objectivity, but also how much of a fallacy that is, because whatever is not in the frame is somehow not present in what's being distributed. The first film me and my brother made is called Anatase in Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe language. It means a movie, but there's also a thought in Anishinaabe that each syllable is like a verb. So Anatase translates to it shines a certain way to a certain place, it flies, it falls, which is like the traditional film apparatus. So shining on the screen, that's the certain way in a certain place. Flying and falling is the film going up and around the projector. So it had this kind of poetic resonance, the title, but for us it also kind of described the process of making that film, which again was our first kind of attempt at completing something. And that film kind of grew out of a lot of grief after our mother had passed away. She was in charge of education for our tribe, and our house was kind of like this drop-in zone where all of the kids in the neighborhood could come and basically be. And her whole thing, Alison Krebs, our mom, was about being a lifelong learner. And she had passed away actually trying to complete her PhD, which was about kind of returning agency of Indigenous knowledge back to Indigenous people, specifically like in libraries, archives, and other kind of government records and holdings. So when she passed, me and my brother were pretty devastated and also very young and wanted to kind of continue her work. And we thought the best way to do that would be to do that back home, also as a way to kind of reintroduce ourselves to our community as individuals, not as her children, but also as a way to like commemorate and also collaborate. Like I think she was with us throughout that process of making that film. But the film kind of revolves around where I'm from. There's oral tradition, and there's this story called the Seven Fires Prophecy, which has been passed down from generation to generation, and it predicts and predates first contact with Europeans. We wanted to create a condition where people could share with us what they wanted to share, as opposed to like trying to extract something from them. So also asking this very open-ended question about like, what do you know about the Seven Fires Prophecy, allowed for this kind of cacophony or symphony of voices and perspectives that we could kind of like collage and build together this narrative of this history of our community. And part of this was really important to us because there is a local history that's told there from a settler colonial perspective, and it's not objective and it's not the truth. And then we wanted to kind of present this alternate history that we all kind of knew to be more truer as a way to counterbalance or counteract that, or to create the kind of collision in discourse.
I guess the way I would explain it is that with the Anishinaabe people, there are 7 different prophecies that describe what has happened throughout the ages.
We've always heard about the seven fires prophecy. I think a fire being almost like a generation.
We're constantly thinking in sevens. My ancestors thought 7 generations ahead.
Because they always looked forward. 7 generations. They say you were responsible for the next 7 generations.
I relate a lot to the 7th fire because it's talking about people of our generation who are retracing their steps to, learn about Native culture that has been lost or wiped out, from our grandparents' generation.
But then another thing that was really motivating for us was thinking about how to make an inherently Ojibwe form of cinema, especially when thinking about just thinking about cinema through a national lens. So, like French cinema, Danish cinema, American cinema, what would Ojibwe cinema look and feel like? And thinking through those things simultaneously while doing these super long interviews, like 2 to 4 hours, and we did like 45 of them which made the editing process hell. But I guess part of the idea in terms of thinking about what Ojibwe Cinema would be is also rethinking how a film is structured. It allowed us to kind of like take apart everything and just take the parts that we liked or that we thought would be relevant or most meaningful to tell this story to kind of assemble it. So one of the things was like thinking, traditionally people think of a film or a feature film as an arc, a beginning, middle, and an end. But we realized that Ojibwe cosmology and thinking is much more circular, and that maybe actually not even circular, but like a spiral. So like it would just kind of keep going around the same thing. And the thing in the middle is like the content or like the heat, but you can't directly show that. So it's like walking around the thing to describe the shape of it. And also there's different ideas of kind of temporality in terms of like we're taught to think about things 7 generations into the future and 7 generations into the past. And that way of thinking has also been really helpful in terms of the political discourse we're hoping to invoke in a lot of our work, because a lot of the times politics can be really frustrating because you want the thing to happen now. But the great gift of thinking about these things 7 generations in the future and in the past is it's very humbling to realize the temporal scale of a lot of these struggles is actually much larger than our lifetimes. And I think that's something we're also trying to communicate across these different practices. And then also just thinking about like the 7 fires prophecy, which is, it's something that's malleable, or old tradition is something that's meant to change. There's an idea that history should become a narrative that serves the people in the present, and the 7 fires prophecy kind of embodies that. Like in 100 years, the different fires or chapters will be different, and 200 years ago they were different, and it's meant to be this living document as opposed to this thing that's codified or printed. And that was also really inspiring for us to think about like, well, how could we adapt this to a film as an oral tradition and like kind of contribute our version of it to this larger discourse? Not saying this is the definitive version at all, but one of the stopping points, and someone else will pick it up eventually and tell their version of that story. This is like in contradistinction to something like Walter Benjamin's idea of like the angel of history, always moving forward and looking back. And again, trying to undermine this idea of linearity with this kind of circle or spiral. And the other collaborative constellation is with Bailey Schweitzer. And Bailey and I kind of make more narrative films, even though I said I would never make a narrative film, because I had this kind of like punk attitude about how it was commercial and bullshit. But also in terms of like this idea of porousness between form, realizing that 9 out of 10 people don't go home or go to the office the next day and tell someone, I saw a really great mid-length experimental documentary last night. They just say they saw a movie. So also like as I got older, trying to think about how to translate the work and the ideas we're trying to put out into the world in ways that are more accessible or palatable, where like someone could just see a movie and have all these ideas spawn from it without having to have this kind of like pretentious or removed veneer of art. And I think in terms of also like trying to break those distinctions, Bailey and I's practice is really focused on that. And we talk about kind of Trojan horse filmmaking, where it looks like a movie, it feels like a movie, but inside of it is this kind of radical potential for different kinds of discourses. And then the third kind of collaborative constellation is one of the core contributors to a public secret society, which is New Red Order. And that's with my brother as well, and Jackson Paulus, who's a Tlingit artist, sculptor and filmmaker. And we've been kind of, working on developing new strategies to promote Indigenous futures as part of the New Red Order. And also anyone can join the New Red Order. We have a hotline. It's 1-888-NEW-RED-1. So one of the kind of conceits of New Red Order is rethinking this idea of the informant. In an anthropological context, it's like, the person who lives in the community that the anthropologist works with. But then like if you think about like crime TV, an informant's a really bad word. You know what I mean? It means like you're a rat or a snitch. It has a very negative connotation. So for New Red Order, we realized also that we as Native artists were being put in that position of having to become an informant. Like, for instance, like Q&As after me and my brother's first film, and people asking us very specific things that weren't in the film at all. They're like, tell us more about where you're from. We love Indians. You know what I mean? And it was like seeing how people were very excited about this identity, but that also how their excitement felt really wrong and inappropriate. What do you want from Indian people? You know what I mean? Just so that way there can be a more open discourse that's realer and less kind of posturing. Becoming part of New Red Order, one of the big revelations was that, well, I guess, again, going back to anthropology, which I feel like is like, especially as Indigenous artists, it's something we're always grappling with, because it's also like how knowledge is produced. So New Red Order itself comes out of a contradistinction from the Improved Order of the Red Man, which is an actual secret society. Or I shouldn't say actual, that's a qualifier. But anyways, the Improved Order of the Red Man dates back to the American Revolutionary War. And there was like the Boston Tea Party, where rebelling British colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians to raid a British ship and throw the tea overboard. So it was like the foundation of America is inherently tied with this idea of playing Indian. Part of the idea is because there's a desire for the kind of freedom that colonists saw in Native people, but also a desire to replace Native people. And what better way to do that than to try to become them? So that's this kind of dynamic tension across all of the history in terms of America that keeps popping up. But out of the people who did the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty, they started a secret society called the Improved Order of the Red Men. And then the Degree of Pocahontas was the sorority version of it. And it still exists today. It's headquartered in Waco, Texas. And it's both of the Roosevelts were a part of it. Nixon was a part of it. And it's kind of like the Freemasons in terms of like people making backroom deals about business and politics, but they all do it wearing headdresses in wigwams. So New Red Order emerges out of the Improved Order of the Red Man. And the reason we're identifying as a public secret society as opposed to an art collective, we try to avoid the term art collective like the plague, is that New Red Order can then have a potential not to be something that's only contained by art. Maybe it could be a political party, maybe it could be a religion, maybe it could be a think tank, that it could have different ways to spiral out into the world.
Because we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And we won't know where we've been unless we look to the past for the future. Because the future is starting to feel a lot like the present. And we all know you'd do anything to escape that.
People don't consider the US, Canada, or even Denmark as having ongoing colonial projects. But meanwhile, there are people who are under the heels of that political repression still to this day. And that it's not something that happened in the past, that it's something that's ongoing. And this kind of temporal distinction, especially with Indigenous concerns, it's like to be authentic, to be Native, you have to exist in the past. Like, I'm not going to be living in a wigwam anytime soon. I can't revive that part of the culture. So to be authentic, you have to be something that doesn't exist anymore, which is this terrible double bind. And I think a lot of our work is also trying to deny that denial. But then even that becomes a limitation because all we're really talking about is saying we're here now, where that's not even thinking about the future. So I think that's why we also keep coming back to this idea of Indigenous futurism, or like, can Indigenous people exist in the future? And let's think about what that's like, as opposed to just demanding that we're seen in the present. But yeah, part of New Red Order's practice is also exhibition making or installation. And we've done kind of a variety of... Well, for instance, like we did a real estate office in New York where people could volunteer to give land back to Indigenous people. And we created all these kind of real estate listings in the windows in downtown New York and had some very strange onlookers who I think were actually trying to buy property and were very disappointed when actually they were realizing, oh, this is just examples of people giving back property. But then there's also kind of a larger research project that has morphed into a pretty large-scale installation. And it revolves around this American sculptor, James Earl Fraser, who was active in the 1800s and early 1900s. And he made the buffalo head nickel and made this kind of iconic statue at the end of the trail, which is a slumped over Indian on a tired horse on the precipice of a cliff. And it's been appropriated for many different purposes, but his original intention was to make it the size of the Statue of Liberty and install it on the Pacific coast as a kind of monument to manifest destiny. Like it worked. Like the Indians got pushed so far to the west coast they were about to fall into the Pacific Ocean. But he did this not out of malice or racism towards Indians. He did it because he grew up in the prairies and had fond memories of living next to the tribe and playing with the kids there. So his way of memorializing the vanishing tribe, which of course was a fallacy, has these really demented repercussions in the present day. We were fortunate to find his archive doing a residency at Syracuse University and have been doing this project called Culture Capture, where we kind of reanimate or bring to life archival material through CGI animation, but also as a way to represent the work that we found in the archive as well. So that's kind of like this involved large 2-screen digital projection with a series of glass negatives affixed to light boxes and some archival 16mm film that we digitized and printed back out. We're really invested in trying to make work that could feel like it's 1 week into the future. And I'm not taking credit for any of this, but it's starting to enter into a larger discourse, or a lot of the work that NRO has done around monuments and calling for the removal of monuments, and then seeing actually all of that happen over the last year. It's whoa. But that's also triggered a different kind of thinking. The monument example is a good one, where it's removal is complicated, especially for Indigenous people, especially when it's monuments that could be deemed racist, but that also involve removing representations of Indigenous people or erasing forms of history. And actually, I think what we're aiming for is something that's more nuanced and more complicated. So specifically with that debate, we're talking about an additive approach. And traditionally, when people talk about an additive approach with monuments, they talk about putting up a plaque that gives historical context. And that doesn't really work for us, because people barely notice monuments, and they notice plaques next to monuments even less. So our idea of an additive approach has started to become thinking about how to kind of deface things, but not by removal, but by addition. So if you could keep adding things on top of this history, formally or literally, materially, that could change what power those objective representations have, as opposed to the easiest thing to do, which is just get rid of it. But what happens when you get rid of something in terms of well, then we'll just do it again. You know what I mean? And I guess, yeah. I mean, the world's a hot mess these days. And I really have no idea what's going on. I'm just kind of holding on. But also am excited about it in terms of feeling like we are in this kind of paradigm shift time where discourses and dialogues are changing in ways that are kind of unprecedented. The power of language and how it's used, and who can say what and when. And those are things that I personally am shifting my own perspective on. Especially, for instance, when we were talking about documentary film, I was always Indigenous people should tell Indigenous stories. And I still feel that. But I also don't feel that it's right or makes sense to foreclose any other possibility. I mean, the running joke is our new Red Order campaign is going to be a pro-miscegenation campaign. So encouraging people to start a race orgy, because then once we're all bits of everyone, then there could be no more problems in the world. So look out for that.